Hey, Mark, good to see you. You're down there in Miami at Trump Doral, big event for Trump today, right?
Right. It's a Latino summit or roundtable. It got postponed because of the hurricane, so they're back on today. So I'm a little frazzled. I apologize for
No,
the
no,
odd
don't worry.
location.
Look, you've covered Trump a long time.
Yep.
Um, we're starting to see these early vote numbers come in. John Ralston, who's no friend of Republicans, reporting, sending off alarm bells in Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina. I was initially like, "Whoa, those are big numbers." What's the feeling among Team Trump about these early vote numbers so far?
The problem with you asking me that question and me answering it is I talk to them often enough to where they have been super confident for about 3 weeks to a month now before the early voting began. And now it's just sort of stratospheric. And as you know, with a campaign, you always have to think you're winning. And even if you're not, you have to convince yourself you are. So I struggle with to what degree is this looking like 2022 where Republicans had all these great signs in the polling and then lost? Or to what degree is their genuine enthusiasm really genuine and the data really indicative of how good things appear to be for them? But I got to say, it's been a high level of confidence for a while, and this has just made it stratospheric. Not saying that the
But
confidence is
but the
accurate, but
difference is don't you think the difference for me is that it's data based. It's not just vibes. It's not like, hey, we got a lot of yard signs up. We got a big rally. They're actually
yeah.
seeing early vote numbers come in percentages that we've never seen. I mean, I joked, I replied to one of your tweets last night when you said we've seen this movie before, and I said maybe it went
Mhm.
directly to Netflix because I've never seen Republicans do this early in early vote.
So what I was saying, we've seen this movie before, is in the early vote phenomenon, and being based in Florida, we have a lot of experience with this. We're one of the first states to really experiment with early in-person voting and absentee voting for a month, ballot voting, mail voting for a month. Is that when that happens, and when one side leaps out to a lead in returns, we don't, of course, know how people voted, just the raw votes and people have showed up. The other side invariably says, oh, this is actually bad for the winning side right now because they're cannibalizing their election day voters. That is,
Election.
yeah, they're stealing, they're robbing Peter to pay Paul. But the thing is that's repeatedly been said here in Florida at various times by Democrats about Republicans doing really well. And then it turns out they wind up being wrong, and Republicans just keep coming and coming and coming. Now, Florida is a red state, so I don't really know what the dynamic is relative to election day vote and the like in, say, Nevada, which was the tweet I was replying to. But by and large, what we're seeing is, for now, a dispelling of a lot of the media narrative that Kamala Harris's ground game is going to just blow the doors off of Donald Trump's because Donald Trump had outsourced his ground game. Right now, we're seeing a lot of genuine enthusiasm from Republicans and some signs that there is a concerted effort to get out some of their voters who might not otherwise have shown up. That is low propensity males. So that's probably what I could say most distinctly right now, but that could change in a few days, right?
You know, it's funny though, because the example that you brought up, I was on our we call the morning meeting every morning on our YouTube channel with Mark Halperin and Dan Turntine, and I said, you know, the funny thing about this cannibalizing election day voters, which you aptly put, is taking someone who was going to vote and just moving their vote up forward, so it's the same vote, which is what really campaigns want to do is get people who've never voted before to vote early. But the point that I made at the morning meeting was the talking points that I had to use at the RNC for two cycles is the talking point that Dems are using now and
Right.
saying, oh, well, they're just cannibalizing. And I think that, like, look, Republicans, maybe not in Florida, but definitely in Nevada and other places, we're election day voters by habit and tradition. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're seeing us vote early, at the very least, and this is the way I look at it, maybe it's just rose-colored glasses, is that at the very least, we're banking our votes, meaning that it's giving the campaigns more funding and more time to go after the low propensity voters, if nothing else.
100%. And that's ultimately the ball game is you want certainty. And let's face it, there's some old voters in some of these states. Obviously, I say this as a Florida man. You want to get your people to vote before they die, right? In some cases I mean, if you have 100 voters or 100,000 voters or 10 million voters or whatever, and you're able to get 6 million of them to vote before election day, it's easier to turn out that remaining 4 million. Obviously, I'm just using kind of raw numbers because I'm not very bright and able to exactly recall the number of voters in the various states. But so far, the Trump campaign and the associated super PACs and super PAC, really, that's helped them, America PAC, the Elon Musk organization,
Yeah.
they seem to be hitting on these cylinders. Now, what we don't know, and what's always talked about with ground game, is like, to what degree is it really real? Right? Like, ultimately, a candidate is what drives people to the polls, either to vote for him or her or vote against him or her. And to what degree is some of this the result of very sophisticated targeting and door knocking? We don't really know. But the anecdote I can share with you is a Republican pollster who I've known for for a while, and who up until 3 weeks ago was sort of catastrophizing with me, saying, man, I would rather be them than us. About 3 weeks ago, this person doesn't work for the Trump campaign. He began telling me, like, things are looking up, like the trend is looking good. And having spoken to him yesterday, this partly comports with what Halpern has been talking about. I don't know if we're talking to the same guy. He said, look, I'd rather be us than them right now. Obviously, that can change. But that is the sentiment, not just in Trump world, but in these sort of broader Republican circles among people who know, not just sort of bullshit lists.
Right. No, and I think that's right. I mean, I can tell when the Democrats are using talking points, defensive talking points, that's not a good place. And I've been there before. So I know what it's like to be on sort of trying to explain why it's not as bad as people think it is. Let me ask you this. You're down there at that Latino event. There's a lot of, some anecdotal, some public polling evidence that Trump is kind of getting into the Latino event, traditionally a Democratic base, as well as black men. What efforts do you see specifically from the campaign that are trying to reach out and grow that vote?
I mean, we've seen it here. He's having a summit. Now, Miami is very friendly territory for Donald Trump when it comes to Hispanic voters, mainly Cuban Americans and to a degree Venezuelan, Colombian Americans, and the like. He also did Univision, a town hall, last week in Doral as well. And that was sort of, to a degree, entering the lines then, although, as you and I know from, 12 years ago, talking about Univision, the way in which they're covering Republicans now has appeared to have changed. But nevertheless, it posed a certain amount of risk for him, but he did it anyway. They're running a fair amount of Spanish language ads, and they have various surrogates. What seems to be, with not just black men, but also with Hispanic men, the driver here is men. There does seem to be a sort of a gender gap here, and increasingly, we began to see it in 2020, Donald Trump appears to be eating into those once relatively comfortable margins with Hispanic Latino voters, and it's mainly among men, not exclusively, but mainly.
And is there anybody driving that effort within, or, is that Trump himself? Is there somebody on the campaign that is, because that's the funny thing. Normally at this point, you see profiles of staffers that are like, so-and-so leading the ground game effort, so-and-so leading the outreach is there anybody on the campaign that's leading the outreach to either one of those groups?
Not that I see. For instance, in Miami, I know Kevin Cabrera, who's a county commissioner for Miami-Dade County, is sort of his touch point person. But this is very much an odd campaign in that everything funnels up to the top, but then the top is flat. You basically have 3 to 4 to 5 people sort of calling the shots in sort of how would you call it, like a kind of a council of elders. Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita are the campaign co-managers. But beyond them, you have Jason Miller, longtime Trump guy. You have Stephen Chung also, and Taylor Budowich, who's probably the least described person here for those sorts of activities. But Susie Wiles, as a longtime organizer and political pro from Florida, understands that there are various nuances with Hispanic voters, and they sort of have a team of thousands working on it. I haven't seen, nor has anyone told me, of any one person being like, I'm the Latino person. That's just kind of not how they operate.
That's what I think is so interesting. Normally somebody is in charge of like coalitions, or we call it specialty media or Hispanic outreach. And it's odd to me that not one person is leading that effort. Because great, I don't really care. In other words, as long as the job's getting done, and it is, but it seems odd that you have a campaign where nobody's leading those efforts and it's getting done. Makes you at least believe that Trump is, he said the other day on some of these, the reason that he's doing some of these podcasts is because Barron Trump was telling him.
Well, I think it's also indicative of the way in which Republicans approach an electorate such as this differently from Democrats. And we really used to see it in Florida. Sorry to keep referencing here. But Democrats used to say, okay, like, We need to talk to people of Puerto Rican descent about Puerto Rican stuff. And we need to talk to Cubans about Cuban stuff and Venezuelans about Venezuelan stuff. Republicans would do that to a degree, but with Trump, there's both sort of a cult of personality aspect to it where this is the guy. You either like him or you don't, right? And also, here are the sets of ideas and ideals and policies that he stands for. And so there's not much kind of narrow casting to these various Latino groups or Latinos sort of more generally. A good example is some of their Spanish language ads. They are essentially, they're properly translated, Spanish language versions of English ads. The message is the same, the language is different.
Yeah, which I'm glad to hear, because I think you described the difference in the parties perfectly. The Democrats view them like as a coalition to get to their winning. Trump and the Republicans, I think, generally are like, hey, you're an American, you share the same concerns about the economy and illegal immigration, et cetera, that everyone else does. One thing that I...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, one of my colleagues from Politico back in the day in 2020, she did a story before I did, Sabrina Rodriguez, she's now at the Washington Post. She hit on one of the things that really turned on Latino voters. And it wasn't just in South Florida, it wasn't just in Florida, but it was also along the Rio Grande Valley, and it was also in Arizona, which was a lot of the messaging from Trump was totally pro-American. And one of the things that's lost in a lot of mainstream media coverage of people who are immigrants or directly descended from immigrants is how pro-American they are. And the flag waving, and some would call it jingoism, of Donald Trump was very appealing to a subset and a growing, it appears, pool of Latino voters of various stripes, various places of origin, and in various states.
You know, you mentioned you're obviously not just at this event in Florida. You're from Florida. You've covered Florida politics for a while. And I say that because you're outside the Beltway. And I think because of that, you see things differently. What do you think? You've worked at NBC, Politico, the Miami Herald, right? And what do you think a lot of your colleagues get wrong when it comes to covering Donald Trump writ large, like a big picture wise?
Well, I guess this would be more of a general criticism of the concentration of news media political coverage in two rather democratic cities of New York and DC. And a lot of decisions on coverage are made sort of above their head and by editors and by committee. And sometimes they reflect more of the cultural biases of those places rather than sort of the broader sense of how people are perceiving things in the country writ large. I think a good example of that will be trans issues. I think I was the first reporter just a few weeks ago to notice, like, wow, Donald Trump is the first presidential candidate to launch a general election attack ad solely devoted to trans issues. And that's news. Like, when something is new, by definition, it's news. And they're putting real money behind it. And the other media, the other national media based in these two cities, at first didn't cover it. And then some of the coverage afterward was like, oh, they're trying this thing, but it hasn't worked in the past. No, they haven't really tried it in the past. But I think that's a good example of sort of cultural bias. You know, having worked at NBC especially, you get an idea of what flies in an organization and the things you're allowed to write about and report about and what things you're not. And one of the things at NBC was greatly frowned upon, for instance, was, hey, Republicans are discussing these trans-related issues because the polling shows that it's favorable for them. We just wouldn't cover that. Whereas we would cover abortion things, and I still do, which is Kamala Harris is talking about abortion because it's favorable to her. There is that sort of subtle bias that, you know, through standards departments and the like, it's sort of pressed into you by osmosis.
Do you think part of it also is that you're living in these communities, talking to people? I mean, you're not based in New York or DC. You actually have neighbors that are sharing to you their concerns that aren't in a liberal city.
Probably. I think that's part of it. I mean, the other thing is I'm old, right? I'm 51. I came up in a different era of reporting. And so...
Be careful what you call old there, Caputo. I mean...
Glad I look older than you, though. You know, my father was a reporter before me. My daughter is now entering the reporting field as well. I was trained that you approach news events as news events. If there's a controversy over it, you tell both sides or you tell all sides, and then you try to synthesize that information. I think to a degree that's just sort of generally lost in a lot of mainstream media coverage right now, and partly that's a reflection of the fact that information structures, that political coverage, I should say, has been concentrated in these various cities. I mean, you saw the terrible way the mainstream media was covering a lot of the Columbia protests and a lot of the anti-Israel protests. Like, the amount of coverage about anti-Semitism and the problems with it on the left was sort of muted relative to how I think it would be had it been another group who had been targeted by protests and demonstrations.
I want to switch back to the campaign for a second, but a lot of talk about potential event with Nikki Haley in the final 14 days. What are you hearing about not just her, but anybody else that might join Trump?
That is the only one. And so, pardon me if you can hear some dishes clattering in the background. I'm at the diner here in Doral. When I'm hearing about Nikki Haley's, they're still in talks to do it, but having it line up, it could be complicated. Now,
why?
I'm for once I'm kind of speechless. They need to make the venues work out right to work for everyone, as I've been told. I can't tell too much more. The plan initially was to have it work or have it appear on Hannity's show. And so if Hannity is dealing with it, he's obviously trying to make it happen. But so far, the schedules haven't lined up, but I'm told that the schedules are going to line up. It's likely to happen.
Okay, so we can expect, but I would have thought it would be an event on stage. You're telling me that there's a decent chance that it happens on Fox on Hannity's show.
It was supposed to be, the discussions have been, and they haven't been fully cut off, that it would be a town hall style on Hannity's show with an audience. And so,
okay, I just wonder. I mean,
yeah.
Because I'm just wondering if you're trying to reach, and my view has always been that the media cares more about this than a lot of people do, meaning that I think the Washington Post and NBC will report on this more than it is, and then a lot of people probably care, but they want to see it. And if it's on Sean Hannity's show, will they actually report it?
I mean, I think they will. Trust me, if there's a gaffe, they're going to report it. I mean, yeah, they're going to report it. I mean, the reality is like Nikki Haley does occupy this unique figure right now in this campaign. It did much greater fashion. We ran a story earlier that we had a poll, it was conducted by a Democratic firm, that showed that her voters, the Republicans and Republican-leaning independents who voted in the primary for her, were favoring Trump by a relatively small margin, only about 9 percentage points over Kamala Harris. And you compare that to like the 31, 32, 33 percentage points they favored Trump over Biden by in 2020. So there's sort of work to do. The real question is to what degree was Nikki Haley just a repository for a lot of these sort of anti-Trump Republican votes? And to what degree does she have a base that she could turn toward him? But in the end, as you know, in a campaign, in the final days, it's all sort of ground and pound and do things that are good for your candidate and try to do things that are bad for the other candidate, and the inverse is true. Try to minimize bad things for your candidate and maximize bad things for the other candidate. Now, Donald Trump hasn't always, let's say, stayed on message. I think over the weekend, the Arnold Palmer package story was probably problematic in broadcasting a more general election message. So this would just help communicate like, hey, here's Donald Trump on stage with her. This is a good thing. But
yeah, I don't think we're getting Arnold Palmer stories with her on stage.
I don't think so.
You've done a lot of reporting on this big event at Madison Square Garden. There's a lot of people who might scratch their head and said, "Okay, New York City, Madison Square Garden. He's not like why, right?" And
it's Trump.
You have been really
okay,
Trump. But so explain to people, if you're watching right now and you're saying to yourself, "Gosh, he was at Coachella. He's going to Madison Square Garden. New York's not in play. Why?" You've been reporting on this for a while and have some insight into it. Explain to people why Madison Square Garden, why New York.
Donald Trump is an out-of-borough New York guy, right? He grew up in Queens, looking into the city of Manhattan and wanting to dominate it. And he did. There's Trump Tower and his name is there and he saved the ice skating rink and all of these things that Donald Trump talked about. But every New York striver, outer borough guy will want to have, who wants to be a name in New York City, is going to want to have a Madison Square Garden event. And as one person had told me at one point, Donald Trump, He's telling people, like, I want to sell out Madison Square Garden. Obviously, it's not going to be sold out, but he just wants it filled because the
You don't
Trump
think
campaign.
what does it seat? 20,000? You don't think it could be sold out?
Oh, I imagine it could at this point. I mean, I am being told that they have something like, more than 100,000 people who want to come. If it's true, but yeah, I imagine if he sold tickets, it could probably happen. Hell, you could give the Trump campaign that idea, and maybe he'll do it. But like, he just wants. We're in the stage of the Trump campaign, which is just go big, have a spectacle, have people talk about it, and the buzz. One of his advisors told me, like, look, the place has already sort of paid for itself. The amount of free media coverage they've gotten off of it, and that they will get, is big. And back to what I was talking about earlier with how the national media is concentrated in New York and concentrated in DC. The national media in New York, they cannot resist making a New York story a story about the nation. And this is going to be happening at Madison Square Garden with a Knicks play. Of course it's going to get coverage.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I've tried to explain it to people this way, which is he goes to iconic places. Yeah. And has big events, and then kind of what you said, right? And then everyone covers it because it's, he went to Aurora, Colorado, not because Colorado's in play, but because it was a backdrop for immigration. He goes to Madison Square Garden because it's Madison Square Garden, and everyone's going to say he went to, and so it gets national earned media coverage because of the iconic nature of the event.
Totally. And I mean, let's face it, though, Donald Trump is going to get coverage anyway because you never know what he's going to say. Back to the Arnold Palmer story, right? So that's going to happen. He's always going to have a built-in crowd anywhere. But this campaign differs from the other campaigns that Donald Trump has had, because in the other campaigns, there was a lot more of a team of rivals thing that wasn't much of a team and a lot of backstabbing. And what you have here is a campaign that's built around the idea that Donald Trump is going to be Donald Trump. And what he wants to do, he's going to want to do, and the Trump tries to, or better said, the Trump campaign tries to effectuate. So Donald Trump wants to have a rally in Madison Square Garden. Campaign's like, all right, fine. You want to have a rally in Colorado? Okay, Coachella, fine. This is what he wants to do, and they're going to do it. And it's largely because it's his idea, it's his interest, and it's his campaign.
I want to end this by playing off something that you just said. I feel like 2016, and I don't mean to say, I was there, so I'm not saying it was a fluke, but I mean, I always say to people, it was like a Reese's peanut butter. Like we had the chocolate and the peanut butter, we got stuck together and it ended up tasting great, but no one knew it up until that time. And it worked, and we got him elected, and it was historic. 2020 to me felt very corporate. It was like, we're going to get a big building in Arlington, Virginia. Everyone's going to wear a badge around their neck, and we're going to have assistants in PowerPoint presentations. And it didn't feel Trump. This time feels like the perfect mix. It's like the porridge that's finally at the right temperature, which said this one's just right. Why isn't there backstabbing? Why isn't there a team of rivals? What is different now?
I think it is by and large the leadership of Susie Wiles and La Savita and Tony Fabrizio. They understand how these things work. They've recruited people who are sort of selfless and more dedicated to the cause about it. And there are other people, and I'm not going to say names, but perhaps you can Google my name and some of them, who have a reputation of constantly stabbing other people in the back. And that has been minimized. Now, obviously, what you're saying here, maybe this is the perfect blend for Donald Trump. We're not going to know until after Election Day, right? I mean, if he wins, everyone's going to say it's perfect. If you lose, well, victory has many fathers, right, but failure's an orphan.
All right, I'm sorry. Last question. All that being said, and with the feeling that people have, are people holding back with thoughts of a second term in terms of jobs, or is there already a lot of buzz about I want this job or this is who I'm going to support? Is that tamped down because of Trump, or is that really happening behind the scenes?
That's happening behind the scenes. When I was in Milwaukee for the Republican National Convention, one of the Trump advisors told me, like, this is bad. We're starting to measure the drapes. We can't help ourselves. Like, we got a long campaign to go. And then voila, 4 days later, Joe Biden drops out of the race. Kamala Harris ascends. Everything goes chaotic. Now the Trump campaign is back to feeling great. And it's just unavoidable to think, like, okay, like, who's going to be press secretary? Who's going to be chief of staff? Who's going to be Department of Homeland Security director, right? Like that, or secretary. That inevitably happens, and yeah, that's happening.
Well, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell to get more.